Labyrinthian corridors, cold rooms, distant moans of pain. Hospitals can be unsettling places, containing disease and despair and death. Who knows what untold horrors lay beyond the veil, just out of reach of human vision? Do spirits walk the halls into perpetuity, unable to escape, longing to fill their once healthy bodies from ages past? Well, let's see what these allegedly true and scary hospital stories show us. Enjoy! Remember to go to darkstories.org and send us your scary stories from Denmark, or stories about anything unexplained or terrifying you've encountered. Check out eeriecast.com to enjoy our other shows. Now, let's begin. Why I Don't Go into Hospital Morgues, from Your Creepy Uncle Jeff. I work in the field of funeral care. Specifically, I work for a company that picks up and transports the bodies of deceased loved ones from hospitals, homes, or anywhere else someone has died to the funeral home, where they'll be kept and processed until finally being put into the ground. I've been in this job for many years now, and honestly, I love it. I get to have a part in helping others during what is often one of the hardest and darkest moments in their lives. Some of the best calls I go on are the ones where the whole house is filled with grieving, crying people, because you know that person was loved and will certainly be missed. Though the job is certainly rewarding, it has its days that one could never forget. Like the day where a man had been found dead on his floor for days with his face melting into the heat register that he fell onto. Or the time a 650-pound woman was found in her room that had so much rancid food, the entire building was found to have a maggot infestation and had maggots falling onto us from the ceiling. Or the 15-year-old boy who hung himself because of his parents' daily reminders of how he wasn't the perfect daughter they always wanted. I could go on, but I think you get the picture. Work can be great, but it can leave dark spots in your memory forever. Getting to the story. One of the most common runs I find myself on is going to hospital morgues, taking out as many people as possible, and taking them to be delivered for embalming or cremation at the many funeral homes around the state. This particular hospital I've been to many times, so many in fact that I knew most of the security guards by name. The guard who came to meet me, who I'll call Jed, escorted me through the winding halls and maze-like labyrinth that seemed to make up the lower levels of hospitals. We talked about our lives, how work was treating us, and swapped stories of the crazy experiences that these jobs will occasionally bestow upon us. When we got to the morgue, I went through the usual procedures. Sign documentation, draw up ankle tags, put on gloves, confirm all the bodies are exactly who they're supposed to be. Typically, Jed will stay with me the whole time, in case I need any help moving someone, and to make sure that everything is locked up again when I leave. This time, though, Jed received a call on his radio about an angry woman who had just attempted to assault a nurse for telling her some information she didn't like. Jed told me he had to go, and that he'd be back as soon as possible. He rushed off and left me alone in the cooler. I didn't mind. Some people find being alone with dead bodies a very unnerving experience, always wary of the haunting gaze of their glazed-over dead eyes, but not me. I like talking to bodies, venting about my day, entrusting important secrets, or just simply telling them how good my lunch sounds. All of which falls onto ears that will never again be able to retell the words I impart to them. As I was detailing the lunch I would be having as soon as I got back to the van, I noticed a sound. It sounded like someone brushing against the plastic of the body bags that the bodies were stored in. I looked around the room, expecting Jed to maybe have come back, trying to startle me like he'd done numerous times before. There was no one else in the room. so I chalked it up to one of the fans rustling some of the plastic. I moved the first body without issue, but when I went to pull out the second one, I heard that sound again. It sounded just like someone slightly moving the plastic shrouds, but in a quiet way, like they were trying to keep me from noticing it. I decided to just load up this last body, and then to make my exit whether Jed was back or not. I opened the bag to compare my ankle tag with the one the hospitals put on the toe, when the lights began to flicker and the fans started to pulse and shudder. It lasted for a long moment, then everything suddenly went dark and silent. I cursed in surprise, then began to slowly shuffle my way across the dark, cold room. I froze in my tracks when the silence was shattered by a quiet sound, seemingly amplified by the silence of that room. The sound of a zipper slowly unzipping from the back of the room. I internally screamed at my body to get to the door, to put as much distance between me and the sound as possible, but it refused to listen. The unnerving sound of the zipper cemented me into place. After a long, tense moment, the sound ceased. My mind was racing to come up with an explanation for the sound. Was it a prank? Perhaps another sound just misinterpreted in the dark room. My panicked thoughts were interrupted by another sound, plastic shifting. Then the slap of something smacking onto the floor. Control rushed back into my body as I heard footsteps slowly smacking one after another on the hard concrete floor. It was coming closer to me. I ran across the room, desperate to find the door and escape this new chilled prison. But the room seemed longer than it should have been. The further I ran, the faster and closer the footsteps sounded to fall. Just as the footsteps seemed to put whatever was chasing me just a few feet behind me, my feet seemed to just fly out from beneath me. I felt the floor with a painful thud, and once again all sound ceased. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, waiting to hear something, anything that would tell me where the source of the sound had gone. The dark and cold were the only things my body could register for a few moments, before I became aware of the sensation of something hovering inches from my face. Once again, my body froze in terror of what unseen horror had placed itself directly in front of me. I felt an icy breath exhale onto my face, the stench of decay and death briefly overloading my senses as the wet sound of a mouth slowly opening began. I felt whatever it was lean closer toward me, just about to touch me, when the door to the cooler burst open. The room was suddenly flooded with light and the sound of fans whirring ceaselessly. Jed asked me if everything was okay as he looked into the room. I was sprawled across the floor, pale and breathless, with a body on the floor on the other side of the room. I told him I just tripped and fell as I was coming out to get him to help me pick up a body that I accidentally dropped. He laughed at me as we picked up and returned the fallen body to its crypt table. I loaded up my last body and bolted out and away from that hospital. I don't know what happened in that room, if it was a hallucination or if I was witnessing some kind of paranormal encounter. I don't know. I still work this job, and I still go to hospitals all over the state, but suffice to say, I don't go into any morgue coolers anymore without someone with me the entire time. I worked in a haunted hospital built in the 1800s. From Anonymous. I've been a nurse for about a decade now. My first job as an RN was at an old hospital that was built in the mid-1800s. The hospital had a really strange layout because it was built into the side of a hill. There were several floors that were basically abandoned, but had been left intact, just in case we ever needed them again. A couple of those floors were occasionally reopened as overflow units, but there was one specific floor that we never used, for whatever reason. That part of the floor was completely inaccessible to the public, so there were never any patients or visitors around that area. About 6 months in, after switching to the night shift, I started hearing weird stories about that one floor. Because of the layout of the hospital, walking through that floor was actually a shortcut to get to our monitor room. The monitor room was a small office in an isolated part of the hospital, where techs would watch a live feed of all the heart monitors being worn by patients. I worked on a cardiac unit, so the monitor room was actually staffed by techs from my department. They all took turns going to the monitor room. Anyway, about 6 months in, I began hearing stories from people who had to walk through the abandoned floor. They would claim to see a little boy playing with a red ball, or just a red ball rolling down the hallway by itself, or a pregnant woman pushing a stroller. A few people claimed to have heard babies crying or kids laughing as they walked to the monitor room. At first, I thought it was odd that all their stories were about babies and children. Except for the ER, this hospital didn't even take care of kids, and hadn't for many years. We would just send any kids or pregnant patients in an ambulance to the nearest women's and children's hospital, rather than keep them at our facility. So I really didn't believe the creepy stories, even after I was promoted to charge nurse and had to start making trips to the monitor room, usually alone, to check on the techs. For several months, I never heard or saw anything strange. Eventually, I did some digging into the hospital's history. I found out that the abandoned floor had once been used for the maternity and pediatric wards, like way back in the 1800s to the early 1900s. I thought it was an interesting piece of history, and it gave a name to the old floor, but I still wasn't convinced that there were ghosts of little kids running around up there. Then, one night, I made a trip to the monitor room at about 3 a.m. As usual, I took a shortcut through the old pediatric ward. Everything was fine at first, until I had walked about halfway through the ward. Out of nowhere, as I was walking by a row of old patient rooms, I suddenly got the feeling I was being watched. My blood ran cold. About 10 feet in front of me, I noticed a door propped halfway open. I can't really explain it, but I felt a sense of dread, like I didn't want to walk by that room. I told myself it was nothing, and I kept walking forward. As I passed the room with the door open, I forced myself to look inside. I was honestly afraid someone was going to be in there, looking back at me. All the lights were off, but due to the streetlights outside, I could see pretty clearly. Inside the room, the bed was neatly made, as if waiting for a patient, but the cupboard doors had been left open. I looked up at the window, and that's when I realized the glass was covered in smudges and little handprints, as if a child had just been looking out the window and putting their hands all over the glass. This was on the 3rd or 4th floor, so I knew the handprints couldn't have come from the outside. It had to be someone inside that room. I turned around and walked as fast as I could to get out of there. I still had to pass 2 to 3 empty patient rooms to get to the exit, and I felt as if I was being watched at every doorway I passed. I knew that housekeeping had cleaned the windows many times since the ward had closed, so someone had left those handprints fairly recently. Because the old pediatric ward wasn't accessible to the public, it was extremely unlikely that a visitor, or their child, had stumbled upon that room. To this day, no one has been able to explain where the child-sized handprints came from, but other people have reported seeing them too, even after housekeeping washed the windows again. I'm still not convinced it was a ghost, but I can't explain what I saw either. The whole thing was odd, and it really scared some of my coworkers. I changed jobs several years ago, but I still hear rumors about that hospital being haunted. Hospital Ghoul, from Anonymous. This story happened with my grandmother about 15 years ago. My grandmother has been sick for pretty much her entire old age, and that required frequent visits to the hospital. As we were running out of money, we couldn't admit her to nice and high-tech hospitals anymore, so we decided to go ahead with a hospital nearby that had a decent reputation and an average team of doctors and nurses. The only problem it had was that the hospital was alleged to be haunted, as it had a morgue in its basement, and rumors had it that people who died in this hospital, their spirits would lurk around the entire hospital premises and haunt people. I was only 9 at the time and pretty afraid and paranoid about the entire situation. So I, by hook or crook, convinced my parents to arrange someone else to stay with my grandmother at night, as I did not want those nasty spirits to be anywhere around my parents. I know it sounds very selfish, but honestly, who could blame me? I was just looking out for them. My uncle, who's about 8 years younger than my dad, agreed to stay with her at night. Once they had settled in and night had already set, my uncle went to sleep early due to extreme fatigue from the activities in the day. My grandmother had fallen asleep, but woke up at 2 in the morning after hearing some weird noises and felt strange sensations at her feet. Now, my grandmother has had her fair share of paranormal and spooky incidents, so she was on edge at all times. Mustering up the courage, she opened up her eyes and looked directly in front of her. There, she saw a silhouette of a woman standing near her feet. This woman was as tall as one could imagine, with crazy long black hair and a strangely thin frame. The woman was sobbing at a very loud volume, enough to wake everyone up, but somehow my uncle seemed to be unaffected by this. My grandmother froze in place. She couldn't even lift up her finger or make a sound. It wasn't sleep paralysis, as this continued on until dawn, when the woman finally vanished into thin air. My poor grandmother had been with that spooky spirit for over 4 hours and couldn't do a thing. Not only that, but later in the day, my uncle saw a pool of blood under my grandmother's bed. Shocked, terrified, and worried, he ducked under the table to check for more. What he saw there made him scream like a little girl. Under the bed, there was more blood and a pair of scissors and an entire human tongue covered in blood. As quickly as my uncle and my sickly grandma could, they got out of that hospital and found a different hospital for her needs. We never went back there and would even avoid going near that hospital. I'm really glad that my grandmother was safe, and God knows what could have happened if that figure decided to attack her. My grandmother passed away last year in April at the age of 80. May she rest peacefully. Strange Occurrences at the General Hospital, from Anonymous. This happened during the month of February in 2001. I now live in another country, and it happened many years past. My daughter is now a grown woman, but I still think about it often. The incident happened in an urban Michigan hospital. I had recently given birth to my daughter, and she began showing signs of jaundice a few days after coming home. She was admitted to the hospital, and I was staying in the room with her. 2 nights into our stay, I'd missed out on getting supper, as my daughter's tests had been scheduled during room service. The baby was under observation beneath the bilirubin lamp, so I went looking for a vending machine. I'd stayed in that hospital many times for extended periods, due to a previous long-term illness. I knew my way around it quite well. I remembered that there were a couple of vending machine courts in the oncology wing, so I started off in that direction. It was rather late at night, and that wing of the hospital was quite empty and dark. I didn't see another person whatsoever. As I walked, things became oddly quiet and close feeling. It seemed as though the corridor went on longer than it should have. There seemed to be more intersecting hallways than I remembered. I felt confused, but driven by hunger pangs, I sallied forth. After what seemed like forever, I came upon a well-lit vending machine area that I'd never seen before, and I thought that I knew that wing like the back of my hand. It was of the usual construction with a glass push-bar entry door. Behind that was a little alcove with vending machines, a small table, a trash receptacle, a large solarium window that looked out onto a little side street which ran parallel to the building, and a glass emergency exit door. I walked into the alcove and stood in front of the food vending machine. Inside of the machine, the product's packaging resembled familiar major name brand items, but the product and company names were off. I selected a bag of Delitos and sat down at the small table. I ate my packet of crisps while looking out at the night through the window. Through the tinted glass about 500 feet to the left, I could see the bright, busy ER entrance from where I was. I remember thinking to myself that there seemed to be more houses on that street than I'd remembered. I actually had a friend who lived on that street. I should have been able to see his house across the road, but the houses were unfamiliar in a nondescript way, and they stretched on further than I could see. I began to have a distinct, uncanny feeling that I didn't belong where I was and should leave that place. I got up, threw the empty crisps wrapper away, and went to the exit. I found that the door had locked behind me. On the wall beside the door I'd come in through was a phone box, so I used it to call the main desk via a marked preset button. The desk staff was absolutely confused when I relayed my location to them. They could not figure out where the heck I was. They rang security, who finally ended up having to briefly unlock every door in the hospital so that I could egress. "You have 10 seconds," the lady on the other end had said, so believe me, I booked it. I began walking briskly towards the ER entrance, and it seemed as though the distance stretched out longer as I was walking. When I got to the awning doors and looked back, there was no outer door, nor an alcove from whence I had just came. From where I stood, there was only a short span between the wing and the large attached clinic on the other side of it, which shared an outer wall. Upon entering, I went straight up to the triage desk, showed them my paper admittance bracelet, and told them what had happened. They were incredulous, but led me back through the main corridor. I unsteadily made my way back through the hospital to my daughter's room, and one of the nurses brought her back in to me soon after. Needless to say, I didn't sleep at all that night. Thoughts of rooms that appeared and disappeared played out in my mind, over and over, and a lurking fear of my child being swallowed up into a non-existent place where she could never be found made me distrustful of allowing her to leave my sight again. I entertained the thought of mentioning my experience to one of the nurses, but I was afraid of being taken for a kook. I looked for that odd little alcove for days after, and every time I went to that hospital, but I never found it again. It still shakes me up to think about that night. I can't help but wonder if anyone else has had the same thing happen to them in that hospital, or if any of the staff who were present that evening could recount the same strange yarn from their own perspective. I often lie awake at night, recalling the events which transpired. I often scour the internet for any paranormal occurrences in that hospital, but so far, nothing has popped up. The Ghost of the Operating Room, from Mikki. My story takes place in a hospital. Both my parents worked in hospitals my entire life, and had numerous ghost stories that they would tell us from the many hospitals they worked in. I started working as a housekeeper at a hospital located in a small town. There, I began to experience my own paranormal experiences. I would see shadows of people walking in completely dark rooms or hear voices in empty rooms. One time, I felt a small hand tugging at my jeans as if to get my attention. I told a coworker about this, and they told me that a few years prior, a 7-year-old girl had died in the room that I'd been in. I'm used to the paranormal. I grew up around it, and I wasn't really ever afraid of it. That was until one week in 2014. I worked the day shift during my time at the hospital, which was typically much busier than the night shift. My coworkers and I would rotate between areas, and this was the week that I would be mopping the operating room, OR, which included the recovery room and the office for the director of the OR. A small hallway connected the three together, which was a very calming experience. It would take about an hour or so, and most of the time I was the only one in the room. During this particular week, a family was staying in a room with their father, who had been admitted. Their room was on the hallway that I was in charge of. One important side note, I don't hold conversation very well, and back then it was even worse. I'd been cleaning the room for this family and their father when I had to go change out the gloves. I didn't communicate this with the family, and even though I came back to the room and finished cleaning, they accused me of skipping past their room entirely. They reported me to my manager and treated me like I was the scum of the earth. When the father was awake, he also participated in the bullying. Eventually, my manager pulled me from that hallway. I could still clean the OR, but I wouldn't deal with the family. The Saturday after they originally got there, I was scheduled to work with one other person. Saturdays were typically a bit slower, and I finished my normal cleaning by lunch. I decided to head into the OR after lunch, as they very rarely did operations on the weekend. The OR was in a hallway by itself that connected the patient rooms to the cafeteria. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, a sense of dread came over me. I pushed through it though, and filled up my mop bucket to head inside and mop. We had to mop the OR 3 times to make sure it was positively clean. During the first mop, my sense of dread kept growing, but I continued to mop until I got to the actual OR. There was a window that looked out at the hallway that connected the office and recovery room. While I was mopping the OR, I felt as though someone was watching me, but every time I looked, there was no one. I finished the first round and went to start the second. When I was about halfway done, I became scared and called my coworker who met me by the door. I told them I couldn't keep cleaning, as I was petrified. They agreed to take over as I was almost done anyway, and I left the room. The Monday afterwards, I went up to my manager and told them about what I experienced, and they went silent. When I questioned them on this, they told me that the family who had been bullying me had left early Saturday morning, after the father had passed away. My coworker, who had that Saturday off, had come in at about 3 in the morning to clean the room. She and my manager had agreed not to tell me for whatever reason. We both agreed that it might have been the father that had been in the OR with me. I'd never feared cleaning the OR before that experience, and I never felt afraid after that day. It was only that one day after the father had died. About a year after this experience, the hospital was closed, and now it sits abandoned. I do not miss the job or the spirits I encountered during my time there. The Trapped Spirit. From Marit. It was a chilly early morning. My spouse had a doctor's appointment and was called in by the nurse. In the meantime, I waited in the waiting room. I noticed I was the only one there, which seemed odd as it's usually quite busy in the morning. But this was different. Behind me there was glass, so I could see what was going on in the hallway, where the CT scan and MRIs took place. It was a separate section, attached to the hospital on the other side. All of a sudden, the lights in the CT scan room started flickering, but there was no one in there. I didn't think too much of it. I mean, it could have just been a malfunction, right? I tried to pay it no mind, but in the corner of my eye, I saw a figure coming out of the room. There was no face on it, just a very dark figure. This startled me. The aura and vibe from this figure seemed angry and scared. When it went past me, I peeked around the corner, and at the very end of the building there were no doors, at least none in use. There used to be a door there before, but it had been turned into a wall and was painted. The figure disappeared into that very wall. I was uncomfortable at this point, hoping my spouse would come back so we could get the heck out of there. I got on my phone and tried to listen to some music to calm myself down. I didn't want to go crazy and become a patient. The moment I began a video, there was a loud banging coming from where the door used to be. It was so loud, I thought the wall was going to fall down. I tried to tune it out, but I began to feel sad. It felt as if the figure who I saw was telling me he or she was trapped there and could not get out of the hospital. All of a sudden, from the other side of the building, which is where we arrived to the office, an old lady in her late 90s walked up to me and said, "You saw him, didn't you?" She told me of a story of a man who died here when this part of the hospital was still active. He was all alone, and now apparently his spirit is stuck in the building. My heart shattered. The woman explained, this man fell into a severe depression due to the sad fact he had no family or friends. He wanted to escape the horror he was going through. He was hospitalized due to an issue with his heart. The man had been in his late 80s. When he was about to die, he asked to be outside when it happened, but the nurses refused his request. He got really angry. After all, he had one wish and was denied. Later on, he was found dead outside of his hospital bed, trying to reach the door. When I heard this, I felt a cold wind come over me. I was quite scared, but more sad. As soon as the lady was finished with her story, my spouse came out of the office. I turned back to where the lady had been standing, and she was gone. There was no way a lady of her age could have went through a hallway so quickly without me seeing her in the middle or end of the hallway. I never found out this man's name, nor the woman's, so I was unable to do more research. Before we left the office, I looked back to where the door used to be, and I said, "Call out for God. He'll help you find the peace you seek." The next time we came back to the office, the nurses were in better moods and couldn't explain why. And to me, the place felt more peaceful. It was as if the man had moved on to where he wanted to be. This made me smile. Having an encounter with the spirit isn't always a bad thing. It can also be a good learning experience, and a moment which might be memorized forever.